We're going to talk about your immune system and how it can be enhanced to fight viral infections. Welcome to True Health Tuesdays. So, the first thing you have to understand is that there are two parts to your immune system. And we're going to talk about here the two parts to your immune system. There is the innate immune system, which as you can see right here, and the adaptive immune system. Now, the adaptive immune system is the part of your immune system that remembers previous infections. We're actually not going to talk about that today. That's the part of your immune system that is related to getting antibodies when you are infected with a virus. No, what we're actually going to talk today is about the innate immune system. The innate immune system is programmed to be able to determine the difference between self and a foreign invader without previous exposure. It's very important in terms of viruses that you have never seen before. And the players you can see here outlined, specifically the monocyte, which is a cell that eats things, and of course the natural killer cells, which is also very important. One of the major components of the innate immune system is something called interferon, or IFN. Interferon is an amazing product. It's an amazing product that your body makes, and it is designed specifically to inhibit and to prevent viral infections from taking over your body. Such to the point that if you want to have a viral infection to happen, the virus has to come up with a way of getting around this system. Okay, this is like the major fence around a facility. If you want to break into this facility, you have to find a way to get through this fence. This interferon is the fence that prevents viral infections. And so it's important that viruses come up with a way to try to get around this. Let's talk a little bit about that. There's been a number of studies that have looked at this. This is one that is from 2002, so over 20 years ago, we had some information about this. And here they talk about viruses and interferon, a fight for supremacy. So in other words, viruses are trying to get into the human body, and interferon is one of those special tools that your innate immune system uses to prevent that from happening. Let's read a little bit about this from this paper that was published in Nature. They say here that type 1 interferons are a group of antiviral cytokines that are induced during viral infections by viral replication products, such as double-stranded RNA. And so this is a trigger, if you will. If this is present, this is going to trigger this type of an immune response. So these IFNs, or interferons, exert their biological functions by binding to specific cell receptors. This in turn triggers the intracellular interferon signaling pathway. And you can see that here later on. This eventually induces the expression of a large number of interferon secreting genes. So those are ISGs, as you can see here, the workhorses of the IFN response. They set up an antiviral, antiproliferative, and immunoregulatory state in the host cell. However, most, if not all, viruses have, it says here, evolved a broad spectrum of strategies to block and interfere the IFN pathway. In other words, again, if the virus wants to be successful, it's got to figure out a way to get around interferon. Common viral strategies include blocking interferon induction and expression, intercepting receptor binding of IFNs through a viral decoy, perturbation of intracellular IFN signaling pathway, and directly downregulating the level expression of these IFN stimulated genes, as you can see here. Okay, so let's take a look here and see, specifically talking about COVID in this case, what has been going on. So let's jump to, now we're looking at June 1st here in 2020. And they say here that studies of SARS and MERS suggest that interferon response is delayed. Okay, so these are successful viruses that have been delayed. Compared with coronaviruses that cause mild disease with milder causes, these two coronaviruses that can cause severe disease. The patients with severe SARS or MERS have higher viral loads and delayed interferon responses. And they realized that even back then, for SARS and for MERS, that patients with more severe disease had less type 1 interferon activity in their blood. And we can see that here with SARS-CoV-2. Notice that if we look at interferon response here, that those with mild disease had higher interferon levels and those with critical disease had lower levels of interferon. So now enter this paper that was just published this year in August of 23, titled SARS-CoV-2 MAC1 is required for interferon antagonism and efficient virus replication in cell culture and in mice. Notice what they found here. SARS-CoV-2 has a gene called MAC1. Okay, MAC1 is a gene that is producing a protein. And what they found is that this specific transcription product, which is found here in the gene around ORF1AB, and specifically we're looking right here on the gene, that seems to convey resistance or at least some way of preventing innate immunity from the host in the form of interferon. And let's show you exactly what they found when they did research on this. What they found was that when they used bronchial cell cultures and when they used alveolar cell cultures, they found that compared to wild-type SARS-CoV-2 virus, when they put a deletion in the MAC1 gene, notice what happened. There was higher levels across the board in all of these, in both the bronchial cell cultures and also in the alveolar cell cultures. Notice all of these had higher levels of interferon when they deleted that portion of the MAC1 gene. They also found in those situations that the SARS-CoV-2 virus was able to be cleared faster when they had higher levels of interferon. Of course, the question is could interferon be a potential treatment in the treatment of SARS-CoV-2? Here's a paper that was published recently in the New England Journal of Medicine back in February of 2023. And it was a randomized controlled trial looking at 1,951 subjects. And in the subjects, there was 83% of them which were vaccinated and about 17% which were not. And they basically gave a single injection subcutaneously of interferon lambda or placebo. And they wanted to see whether or not it would prevent hospitalization or ER visits in people who had outpatient COVID-19 that presented within 7 days. So again, hospitalization or ED visits within 28 days of coming down with SARS-CoV-2. And what they found was that when they looked at the relative risk in the placebo group, 57 out of 1,018 had to go to be hospitalized or go to the emergency room within 28 days, whereas those that were given interferon lambda, in other words, a way to boost up and increase interferon levels, notice that there was a reduction of almost 50%. Now, the absolute risk reduction is simply the difference between these two, which was 2.9%, which translates into a number needed to treat of 35, which is not bad. A 35 number needed to treat to prevent one hospitalization or ER visit within 28 days. That's pretty good. Now, if we look at the breakdown on this, the question is, of course, does this work for those that are vaccinated and unvaccinated? And the answer is yes. Okay, so remember that 83% of the subjects in this group had at least one injection of a vaccine. That's how they counted vaccinated. At least one shot of a vaccine at any time in their previous history. So if we looked at those, 4.6% of those people had to, in the placebo group, become hospitalized or go to the emergency room. Those that got pegylated interferon, that dropped down to 2.4%. Okay? Whereas in the unvaccinated arm, there was 10.2% that needed to be hospitalized or go to the emergency room in that group, whereas when they got the interferon, it dropped down to 4.2%. So again, a reduction. In other words, there was a reduction in both groups equally. And this worked, in other words, whether or not you were vaccinated or not. And again, if we look at hospitalization or death, COVID-19, you can see here going from placebo to the pegylated interferon lambda, a reduction. Whereas when they got this single dose of a subcutaneous injection, you can see here that it went from placebo to pegylated interferon. There was hardly any difference in terms of adverse events. And so the results of this trial showed that the risk of COVID-19 related hospitalization or an ED visit was approximately 50% lower in the interferon group than in the placebo group. Results were consistent regardless of vaccination status. And the safety showed that the incidence of adverse events was similar in the two groups. Of course, we talked about this earlier, and that is that how important it is that interferon be secreted. And in this randomized controlled trial, we showed here how giving exogenous or extra out-of-body supplementation of interferon could be beneficial. The question is, of course, is whether or not we could do this naturally by just telling the body to produce more interferon. And there's an interesting study that was published a number of years ago showing that hyperthermia, so getting someone's temperature up to 39 degrees centigrade, could do the same thing. They say here 39 degrees centigrade in human volunteers by immersion in warm water rapidly alters the cell populations in the peripheral blood. In addition to granulocytosis, there is an alteration in the normal ratios among T lymphocyte subsets. Now notice here that a temperature threshold of 39 degrees centigrade was able to produce 10-fold more interferon than cells withdrawn at basal core body temperatures. And take a look at this graphically. So you can see here that once it reached 39 degrees, there was a massive increase in the amount of interferon. And you may think that this is actually new information, when in fact, this has been going on for some period of time. And I draw your attention here to the Battle Creek Sanitarium back in the 1900s, where a lot of this stuff was being pioneered by luminaries in the field. This was the ability of increasing the body temperature using a hot bath, as you can see here. And by the way, this is in the same sanitarium. This is a light therapy, which of course is very near and dear to my heart because we've talked about light therapy as well. Here we can see bath attendants at the Battle Creek Sanitarium in 1890. And you can see here that it obviously took a lot of work to do this. Here we can see more hydrotherapy being applied. These are hot towels that are being applied to the human body to increase the core body temperatures, to induce these sorts of things. Of course, they didn't know about interferon at that time, but they knew that increasing the body temperature seemed to have an effect on getting rid of viral infections. Some of the famous guests that would come to the Battle Creek Sanitarium, people like Amelia Earhart, the actor who played Tarzan in the early series, Sojourner Truth, C.W. Post, who of course was the inventor of Post cereals, along with, of course, the Battle Creek Sanitarium medical director, who was John Harvey Kellogg, but also presidential People also came to the Battle Creek Sanitarium, people like Eleanor and Teddy Roosevelt, Mary Todd Lincoln, Henry Ford, for one, George Bernard Shaw, and John D. Rockefeller. Now, of course, all of this was going on, and they were looking at this. And of course, when the 1918 pandemic rolled around, there was obviously a thrust to see whether or not this would work for that as well. And there was a gentleman by the name of Wells Rubel, who was a physician at the sanitarium in the Northeast in Boston, who saw this as an opportunity to use this type of hydrotherapy to increase the body temperature and to have this effect. I don't think he knew that he was increasing interferon at the time. I don't think they knew about that. But he said here, and he published in this journal article called Life and Health, which we'll put a link to in the description here. You can actually find it on the internet as well. He says that the present epidemic of influenza has furnished excellent opportunity to test out the efficacy of rational treatment in dealing with respiratory disorders, especially in conditions accompanying and following attacks of influenza. Here is what he showed. He showed that in the Army hospitals, which he compared his treatment to, that early on they did not use things that would increase the temperature, but rather things that would decrease the temperature, things like aspirin, which had just come out in 1899. And notice that a whopping 16% of those that came down with illness in the Army camps went on to develop pneumonia, as opposed to only 2% in the sanitariums who were given these treatments to increase body temperature. And so they had very few pneumonia cases. Once you develop pneumonia, as you can see, there was a similar amount of people who came down with death from pneumonia, actually even more in the sanitariums. But because so few developed pneumonia, you can see here that they enjoyed 1/6 of the infection fatality rates that the Army hospitals did. Another example that I can find looking back, because we don't have randomized controlled trials on this, is the Danish-Norwegian seminary, the Hutchinson Seminary in Hutchinson, Minnesota. There was an article that was published when, during the pandemic, the entire seminary came down with an illness very quickly. And we can see it here, actually published not in a scientific journal, but actually in a religious periodical. And it reported on what was going on there in the Northwest, in Minnesota. And it says here, and I'll just blow it up here, is on the authority of Dr. Fred Shepard, health officer of Hutchinson City, it may be stated that no public institution in the state of Minnesota up to date made a record in handling influenza, the worldwide epidemic that has swept millions into their graves, like that to the credit of the Hutchinson Seventh-day Adventist Seminary. It goes on to say that the seminary, with 120 of its 180 students and teachers housed under one roof, was invaded by the malady 3 weeks ago. Symptoms of the malady developed with some 90 of these, and under the direction of Dr. H.E. Larson, a graduate physician, member of the seminary faculty, every person showing indication of sickness was at once put to bed with a trained nurse taking the temperature and watching for symptoms of the epidemic. If those symptoms developed, the patient was required to remain in bed. There were so in other words, there was isolation here. Okay, there were no drugs to be given, but with complete rest and quiet when a carefully regulated and fomentations. Now that's the term that we use for putting hot towels on the chest, and it was applied to the throat, chest, and the abdomen. The treatment is almost in every case reduced the temperature of the patients in a day or so, and they were apparently well, but they did not end the matter with them. The next danger was that of relapse. To guard against this, every patient was required to remain abed from to 5 days after apparent full recovery, according to the state of their flu affliction. As a result of this system of handling a disease that is scoring thousands of victims every day, there has not been one case that could have been called serious or a single death in the seminary, although there were more than 90 persons affected. The record is remarkable. It makes the ordinary methods of dealing with the flu appear irrational. We will add that we were indeed thankful to God for his protecting care and for the untiring efforts of Sister Louise Knudsen, our seminary nurse, and for the assistance of the other nurses and helpers. Notice here that it wasn't just a matter of passing out meds. This was very labor intensive to do this kind of work. The hydrotherapy treatments under the blessings of God are indeed helpful, as is recognized by this article. So they put a lot of emphasis here on the hydrotherapy. This just wasn't them doing this. This is also being studied and researched around the world. And there was an Austrian psychiatrist by the name of Julius Wagner-Jauregg who found in his observations that patients in his insane asylum who had come down with neurosyphilis seemed to get better when they had a fever. And so he had an idea of actually infecting them on purpose with the benign version of malaria that would give high fevers. That was Vivax and Falciparum vivax, basically. And so when he infected these patients with malaria, they developed very high fevers. But notice that there were other ways of doing this. This is a paper that was published back in 2013 reviewing this. He would also use the immersion of an individual in a hot bath or placing him in a heat cabinet. And it says here that Wagner-Jauregg's therapy was highly admired and was used on neurosyphilis cases well into the 1950s. However, with introduction of penicillin in 1928, fever therapy effectively ended. In other words, they found a equally effective way of treating this through medications that was a lot less labor intensive. And actually, as it turns out, he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine. You can see him right here, actually infecting a neurosyphilis case here with the blood of somebody who was infected with malaria. And of course, the high heat and fevers would cause the induction of interferon, which would eventually kill the syphilis. And for that, he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1927 for his work showing that heat could actually treat and cure disease. And this is what he did the work on in 1917. This is right before the pandemic of 1918 in Austria. He did this. So we said, though, that he won the Nobel Prize in 1927. In 1928, ironically, the very next year, there was the discovery of penicillin. And we have Alexander Fleming who discovered this medication, and it would kill bacteria on these petri dishes. And for that, he won the Nobel Prize in 1945 for the discovery that was occurring in 1928. And this set us on a completely different path. This looked at randomized controlled trials with medications. This was much less labor intensive, and it was able to affect. And so what we did here, and I want you to notice the paradigm shift, is instead of finding ways to enhance the body's ability to clear the infection itself, instead of finding ways of enhancing the body's own immunity, what we started to do was do a lot of the complicated work that the immune system was doing and actually find chemicals and products that would affect the bacteria itself without necessarily affecting the human body as much as possible. So these medications, otherwise known as antibiotics, were discovered, which were much easier to administer. And so as you can see, remember now, we had the bath attendants, very labor intensive, but these treatments were effective at inducing the interferons that would overcome the infection of the virus. Now, a lot of this work from 1928 on involved randomized controlled trials. There weren't a lot of randomized controlled trials prior to that. And so when this type of treatment was at its heyday, they didn't actually test this using randomized placebo-controlled trials. Of course, it'd be hard to do placebo-controlled trials, but it wasn't done. And so the issue here is that we do not have very good randomized controlled trials showing that this form of therapy works. However, there was a time where it was the standard of care, and it was what everyone did to improve outcomes in viral infections. And the reason why I think this is important is because as we talk about the pandemic and we look at the pharmacological supply chains and how complicated they are, how difficult they are, and how we could run out of these things, as we remember not only this pandemic that we have just come into and are still in some cases here, But we also think about future pandemics. Let it not be forgotten that it took us over a year to develop a vaccine for this pandemic. And so if we're looking for a way to treat a viral outbreak, don't depend on a vaccine that may or may not be already developed for that virus. Similarly, a lot of people have argued that there are off-label, already manufactured medications that might be beneficial against such a vaccine or such a viral outbreak. That is not taken for granted. That may not be the case. There may or there may not be something that is effective against viruses at that point. However, we can say this, that if there is something that is effective, there is a very good chance that it's not going to be universally available for a number of reasons. Number one, the supply chain is very fragile. Number two, there is a bottleneck in terms of prescriptions and pharmacists. And number three is that if it is effective, it will likely be hoarded and taken for resale, just like toilet paper was. And I think that this is probably our best shot at having something that we could use if we could learn how to use this, if we could be intelligent in its use for a potential outbreak in the future. And I'm not the only one that's thought of this. There is a gentleman by the name of Bruce Thompson who has also studied the protocols of hydrotherapy going back to the John Harvey Kellogg days and has put together a beautiful website called Hydro for COVID. This is also available on the domain site traditionalhydrotherapy.com, where it goes through very specifically how these things are to be done and how they were done. And I believe it's a very actually forward-thinking website. It's very specific. It says that this type of therapy is to be used in addition to standard medical care. It's not to be used as an alternative to standard medical care. It uses heat to enhances the body's ability to fight off the coronavirus in the early stages of infection. I would say that since this is stimulating your body's ability to create interferon, that this not only works for COVID-19, but just about any viral illness that would require interferon. And this, I think, is really important. They also go on and state here how fomentations are to be used. And for those of you that are interested, there is also the book published by John Harvey Kellogg on rational hydrotherapy. It was published in 1918, ironically, right when the pandemic hit. And it was, interestingly, over 1,000 pages long, so very complicated. Now, there are people that are looking at this, and this was published in Medical Hypotheses back in 2021, Hydrotherapy in Prevention and Treatment of Mild to Moderate Cases of COVID-19. Again, there has not been any randomized controlled trials published on this mode of therapy, but there should be. I think that this is something that should definitely be investigated. It could be done very easily, and its investigation would be worthwhile. So my advice would be to learn how to do hydrothermal therapy or hydrotherapy. I highly recommend going to the website hydro4covid.com and learn how to do this type of therapy, especially as we're entering into the flu season and COVID-19 is still something that is there.